Well, we're very glad to have with us the co-authors of the book, John Owens and David Fletcher. John and David, thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to the Hall of Fame airwaves here. And we're glad to have an opportunity to talk about this book. I was mentioning off air a moment ago that this book kind of hits home with me. I know it'll hit home with other fans too. But 1972 was really the first year that I can remember following baseball. I was all of 7. The year that I started collecting baseball cards. It was the year that I really started to follow the game and have been following it ever since. But we're very glad that you could both join us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Bruce. Great to be here.
Hey, thanks, Bruce. We are great to have an opportunity to talk to you. And I'm glad this was sort of your first year loving baseball. It was a very special year with baseball because it was the last year that pitchers bat in the American League. And there were a lot of changes after this year. So it was also the first baseball strike.
Yeah, it is one of those historic years. It was kind of the end of some things, beginning of other things. I want to give you a little bit of background information on both our guests. John Owens is a writer, a journalist, director, producer, and videographer. He's done writing for the Chicago Tribune, the Los Angeles Times, serves as a producer at one of the Chicago television stations. And then David Fletcher is a doctor, a medical doctor, also a noted baseball historian, and someone who was a close personal friend of Dick Allen. Gentlemen, I'd like to begin by talking just a little bit about Chicago in the early 70s to create the backdrop for this book. Let's begin with John Owens. What was Chicago like in the early 70s in terms of safety in the city, in terms of politics, in terms of crime? Set the scene, if you will.
Right. Chicago then, as in now, is a great city, one of the great American cities, one of the great cities in the world, an underrated city in a way. Also a city that has its flaws and had its flaws back in 1972. You mentioned crime. Crime, it is a major factor in all urban areas, including Chicago. And I think that that's been overblown nationally. That said, the homicide rate began to increase in the early 1970s, just as now it's increased over the past 10, 15 years. But really, Chicago, one of its hallmarks and one of the things that people talk a lot about Chicago is the segregation and that was created by redlining, which created predominantly African-American neighborhoods where people were locked into their neighborhoods because they couldn't buy into other neighborhoods due to redlining, due to federal and state and city regulations that kept Black families from moving elsewhere, to other areas within the city on the south side, the west side, and the north side. That was changing in 1972. You had the Fair Housing Act passed during the LBJ administration in 1968, and you had the boundaries beginning to blur. And as a result, in Chicago, as in other urban areas in the north, there was pushback, and there was resistance from white families who did not want to be pushed out of their neighborhoods by African-American families, did not want African-Americans living in their neighborhoods because they felt that their property values would drop. And that was a main theme in neighborhoods surrounding old White Sox Park. White Sox Park and the Dan Ryan, the expressway that runs right by it, was sort of a boundary, sort of a boundary line between white and Black. White ethnic neighborhoods like Bridgeport and Back of the Yards were to the west of the ballpark, and neighborhoods like Bronzeville and Kenwood, Oakland are to the east. And you had our mayor of Chicago at the time in 1972 celebrating his 17th year at City Hall in Bridgeport. He was the guy who was sort of spearheaded. He was the guy who really put Chicago on the map as a world-class city by, reimagining the downtown area. But he sort of neglected the neighborhoods while he was doing that. So you had that story, and you had, politically, you had Richard J. Daley. He was still the voice in Chicago, but you had young Turks who were challenging him, from aldermen, liberal aldermen like Bill Singer, who's a prominent character in the book, to Reverend Jesse Jackson, still around today with Operation Push, who was just had launched Operation Push a few years ago. He became sort of he was with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, but he broke away from them, became sort of a renegade, and launched this group. So Daley was seeing challenges from young Turks like that, and from the sympathetic aldermen like Ed Verdoliak and Ed Burke, who were looking to grab some power at City Hall. So it was a time, as we say, a time of transformation in the city of Chicago.
David, what about your perspective? What are some of the specific memories that you have of 1972 Chicago?
Well, I will give my age to make sure your listeners and viewers are aware. I was in high school, senior year in high school. So obviously, I remember the times well. We'd gone through the late 60s and early 70s with the transformation of the city. I grew up in the western suburbs. In Glen Ellen, I played baseball. I was a huge Sox fan. I also liked the Cubs. In Chicago, it was acceptable to like both teams if you lived in the suburbs. So I went to a lot of games, but I was just mesmerized with the advent of Dick Allen, because the Sox really sucked from the late 60s to the early 70s. They were about to leave town. Then they lost 106 games in 1970. They had less than 500,000 fans to show up. And so we needed a superstar. We needed somebody to electrify the community. And suddenly we had Dick Allen come in 1972, and he was Michael Jordan before there was Michael Jordan. People will never understand what I'm saying about that unless they were around that time. But he was such an electrifying player. He didn't go to the bathroom when he was up to bat. Vendors stopped in their tracks. It just brought so much excitement. And that's what I bring. It just was a special time. There was suddenly two teams in Chicago that were relevant. Suddenly the Sox were finally, taking over the Cubs as far as attention. And the 72 pennant season just was exciting, especially in the month of August. The Sox came back 9.5 games out to having a 1.5 lead at the end of August. And it just was a very special time in Chicago, and it saved the franchise. And so, we're blessed with this special year, by a player like Dick. That was his 1972 season was probably one of the best baseball seasons by any ball player ever.
You bring us to the subject of Dick Allen. That's a nice transition to the title, which folks in Chicago probably understand right off the bat. Others may not. Explain the title, Chili Dog MVP.
Well, Chili Dog MVP refers to Dick Allen, of course. Dick Allen traded to the White Sox in late 1971, traded for another great player, Tommy John. And he held out for a while during the baseball strike, first major modern baseball strike in spring training in 1972. Finally signed a few days before the strike was settled. And when the season started, he immediately carried that team and played every day and pushed them almost single-handedly into contention. And by June, he was dog tired. The White Sox were playing a doubleheader on June 4th, 1972 against the hated New York Yankees. They're always their main rival, especially in the 1950s and 1960s when the Yankees and the Sox were perennially the two best teams in the American League. And Dick played the first game and was given a rest by his friend and manager, Chuck Tanner, a man he grew up with in Wampum, Pennsylvania. And so Dick chilled out in the locker room while the Sox played the Yankees in game two. The Sox won game one. He was lounging in the whirlpool and taking a much needed break. He partook in, he sampled some of the great food that was in the clubhouse at the time. And in this case, it was a chili dog. and he was at his locker with his jersey unbuttoned, eating a chili dog, dribbling the chili juice down his red pinstriped White Sox jersey that they wore at the time, when all of a sudden the bat boy, a young man who grew up near the area named Rory Clark, rushed into the locker room and said, Dick, Chuck Tanner wants you to bat. We're down 4-2, bottom of the ninth. They just brought in Sparky Lyle. If you remember Sparky Lyle, he was the dominant reliever for the Yankees in the early 1970s. When they called Dick up to the plate, the 51,000 fans in attendance were like, it was a bat day, one of the largest crowds in White Sox Park history. They were like thrilled to see Dick. Sparky Lyle was warned by White Sox second baseman Mike Andrews, who's come in. You're a former teammate of Sparky's on the Red Sox. Mike Andrews, who was on base at the time, said, "You're in deep trouble, Dick." He's stronger language than that.
Yeah.
And Dick, with the chili juice all over his jersey, walked up to the plate. After one pitch, hit a line drive rocket into the lower left field stands with 2 men on to win the game for the White Sox 5-4. And it was a sort of the significant moment of that season to show just the charisma and the astonishing abilities of athletic abilities of Dick Allen, a man who just had an incredible season and carried a team that was not expected to be in contention, carried a team to a surprising second place finish to the dominant Oakland A's in the AL West that year.
Any sense as to whether Dick was upset that his day off was interrupted?
I'm sure he was upset at the time he was called out to the plate, but he was such a phenomenal player that, he always rose to the moment, especially in that year, 1972. So after hitting that home run, the stadium just erupted. The stands were literally rocking in the old stadium. So it didn't bother him after he hit it.
We have a great image up on the screen from shortly after the trade. This is where Roland Heeman, the general manager or the de facto general manager of the White Sox at the time, essentially introduced Dick Allen to the media. We see the 1970s fashions in full display. The trade was Dick Allen for Tommy John and a utility infielder named Steve Hunts. This was very much Roland Heeman's trade. Did he feel like he was taking a chance on Allen given some of the controversies from early in his career? Was this a rolling of the dice? Is that what Roland Heeman, was that his perspective in making this trade?
Well, I knew Roland very well, and this was his signature trade of his career. And his 1972 season as a director of personnel was his first time he got the Major League Baseball Executive of the Year award in 1972. And so this was not at all a roll of the dice. He actually wanted to get Dick Allen. As soon as he got hired by the White Sox in September 1970, he inquired to the Cardinals to trade Louis Aparicio to the Cardinals for Dick. He got rebuffed, but he had a chance again in 71. I've heard from him multiple times. Unfortunately, Roland died in December of 21. But Roland regaled me multiple times over the years about the day-to-day intricacies of him pursuing Dick. He knew that he would be an impact player, and the Sox had a better year in 71. They had Bill Melton, who I'm wearing his uniform from 72, number 14. He was a home run champ. This is somebody who played at Comiskey Park, which was a cavernous stadium. And so the Sox had some young new talent, and they needed one more big bopper. And that's what Roland gambled on. He obviously also had the support of Chuck Tanner, the manager who came with him with the California Angels to Chicago, because Chuck and Dick lived close to each other in Western Pennsylvania. And Chuck Tanner knew his family, knew his mother, Ezra. And he was actually the person that helped, through his mother, talk Dick out of holding out and joining the White Sox in 1972.
The numbers that Dick Allen put up in 1972 were especially impressive, given that it was a pitcher-dominated season. And it was one of the reasons why the American League ended up adopting the DH after that year. So Dick Allen bats .308, 37 home runs, 19 stolen bases, 99 walks, slugging percentage over 600. So these were incredible numbers for that era. Somehow he was not the unanimous choice as MVP. There actually were 3 writers who voted for other players. I know one vote went to Joe Rudy. I believe one vote to Sparky Lyle. And I think there may have been a 3rd vote that went to Mickey Lolich, if I'm not mistaken. But near unanimous MVP selection. I'm curious, guys, though, what was the initial reaction before Dick starts putting up these big numbers with the White Sox in 72? How was he initially received by the community in Chicago? Let's begin with John.
Yeah, well, the initial reaction, specifically from the media, was skepticism. And that was a standard media reaction with regards to Dick Allen, which was generated by his controversial time in Philadelphia, where he warred with the media from the very, very beginning. Unfairly, he was a very intelligent man. He grew up in a diverse community in Wampum, Pennsylvania, had to deal with racism in the minors, where he was a sort of a guinea pig for the Phillies, playing in Little Rock, where he was told N-word go home every day, and it was booed consistently. But he was, as you mentioned, he was perhaps the greatest player of the 1960s, greatest offensive talent of the 1960s outside of, say, Hank Aaron. That talent, despite that talent, he was on some lackluster Phillies teams after 64. Had a controversial fight with a teammate named Frank Thomas, not our Sox Frank Thomas, but the Frank Thomas who played for the Pirates and the Phillies in the 50s and 60s, a racially tinged argument that led to Thomas's release from the Phillies, and Philly fans blamed Dick Allen, and he was booed from 1964 when that incident happened, 1965 when that incident happened, all the way until he left Philadelphia in 1970, traded to St. Louis. And the reputation that followed him, he'd walked from the Phillies a couple of times, left AOL a couple of times for a variety of reasons, and he was troubled. He was very troubled during his time with the Phillies, and developed a drinking problem. And he definitely had some issues, but he was a great teammate, a legendarily great teammate. So when he got to Chicago, the media, taking on what they had heard from Philadelphia media, they were immediately skeptical. Bill Gleason, a great columnist for the Sun-Times for years, made jokes about his alcoholism. Other writers were doing the same. But from almost the beginning, the fans loved this man because he brought them something different. The White Sox were a great team in the 1950s and 60s, but they were a team that their foundation was pitching. They had great pitching in the 1960s. They never really had offensive talents. As Doc mentioned, Bill Melton was the first White Sox player to lead the league in home runs when he hit 33 in 71, the year before Dick got to the team. So he was something completely different for not only the White Sox, but for the city of Chicago. He was a flashy, colorful African-American superstar, the first such superstar that Chicago had had. Chicago had African-American superstars, but they were very low-key and very modest. Dick was low-key in a way, but he was his own man and independent, and fans appreciated that. They appreciated him for his iconoclastic behavior. So as Doc mentioned, he was Michael Jordan before Michael Jordan. He was just, the fans loved him. He got a TV show soon after he got here. He was Mr. White Sox. So, and then, after being the subject of adulation from the fans, the media also began to appreciate him a little bit more. So Chicago became his real the real home for Dick Allen. This was where he was he wasn't really celebrated anywhere else, but he was always celebrated here in Chicago.
So you think it's accurate to say that from the beginning, the Chicago fan base was willing in general to accept a black star player?
Yes. I mean, he was embraced, even though obviously we had Minnie Minoso, which was a Latin black player. Dick was really the first African-American superstar on the South Side, and he brought out quite a few minority fans. That's what I remember the most when I went to 20 or so games that year, was how diverse the fan base was. And he noticed that himself. He talked a lot about that with me when I got to know him really well the last 15 years of his life. Mm-hmm. So he was accepted by the fans, and it was just for him to have the adulation, but also was different because he was 30 years old. Him and Wilbur Wood, they were the old guys on the team, and they provided some necessary leadership to a bunch of 20-year-olds. If anybody are movie fans, I remember the second Star Trek film, that Captain Kirk was leading these young, people on the Star Trek Enterprise, and he's mentoring them. It's a very similar situation. Just he loved that, and he mentored, Goose Gossage was his rookie season as a 20-year-old, and led him to a Hall of Fame career because of Dick teaching him how to pitch. He had 20-year-old Terry Forster, who actually had better offensive numbers in 1972 than Dick did, which I used to always kid Dick about. Yeah. And he's still the best pitcher, batting average in Major League Baseball history. So was just absolutely adored, just leadership. He was just a great teammate. He was essentially the co-manager with Tanner, because he was basically the bench coach there, and they just had some great camaraderie. And it just, he led by example.
You mentioned Chuck Tanner. One of my favorite photographs of Dick Allen is this one. You can't see him in terms of his face, but you see that huge number 15 uniform number. The Sox used to have enormous numbers on the backs of their jerseys. And the first guy to greet him after hitting a home run is Chuck Tanner, who's on the far left with his two arms extended, ready to get a low five from Dick Allen. Does any of this happen without Chuck Tanner? We know that earlier in Dick's career, he had conflicts with managers like Gene Mauch. There apparently was some tension between Dick Allen and Walter Alston in Los Angeles, though not to the level of the problems that maybe he had with Mauch. Does any of this occur without Chuck Tanner?
Definitely not. Chuck Tanner, as I mentioned earlier, he grew up with the Allen family, so he knew about Dick and his other brothers who were also star athletes in Western Pennsylvania. And Chuck, from the time he got to the White Sox, that was his goal. And that was the goal of Roland Hemond as well, to get Dick Allen, because they knew how special, not only how special a player he was, but how decent a human being he was, and how, how misunderstood he was. They knew that, like Doc said, he had the ability to be a leader in the clubhouse, which is what he turned out to be. Hey, Chuck Tanner was quote unquote a player's manager. He never hesitated to give a player an honest opinion of how he was playing, and he was literally a hands-on manager. His son Bruce would tell stories about how if he didn't like what a player was doing, he wouldn't hesitate, like slamming a player into a locker to let him know that he wasn't doing what he was supposed to be doing, something you obviously could never ever do today. But he was also, he was a former player himself, played for the Cubs among others, and knew what major leaguers were dealing with. So he was could be a stern man, but he was an understanding man. He's also advanced. He was ahead of his time in terms of analytics, rudimentary analytics. He was doing spray charts for the opposition way before anyone else, color-coded spray charts, which would let pitchers know where various hitters, where their sweet spots were in the field. So he was ahead of his time as a tactical manager as well. But he understood Dick because he grew up with him, and he understood players in general, players' mentality in general.
I think Tanner is really an underrated manager in history. He was the guy who experimented with a 3-man rotation with the White Sox. This was to get Wilbur Wood more starts. That certainly paid dividends. When he moved on to the Oakland A's in the later 70s, he was the guy who let that team run wild on the bases. I think they stole over 300 bases, set all sorts of records. He was the guy that helped bring together the Pirates in 1979, win a world championship. You wonder what would have happened if Dick Allen had had a Chuck Tanner for all of his career or most of his career. The controversies probably would have been minimized. Maybe his offensive numbers would have been even greater, as good as they were.
I would agree with that, Bruce, very much so, because the Phillies did not do a very good job of protecting Dick when he came up. John talked about his experience in Little Rock. That was a seminal moment in his life. He grew up in Western Pennsylvania, which was had quite a bit of racial harmony. I've been to Wampum, and it was a community where there was a lot of acceptance. He was a star basketball player in their state championship basketball team in 1960. So he had an environment which was completely different growing up, and he got sent to the South, where he was right after he had the famous Supreme Court decision, Brown education case, and just a terrible situation, and he just wasn't protected, and the Phillies did nothing to help him. I mean, Jackie Robinson was very fortunate that the Dodgers prepared him well and protected him. Dick had nothing, and it really scarred him. Ferguson Jenkins was Dick's roommate on the road at Little Rock, and he'll talk a lot about that, how Dick's experience in Little Rock, really kind of scarred him. But he ended up winning the fans over there in Little Rock, and he got brought up to the Phillies in early September of 1963 and never looked back. But I agree with you. If he had a different manager and ownership, I think it would have been much different. He loved his time in Chicago, especially the owner, John Allen, who was an unheralded savior for the White Sox franchise, just adored Dick. And they just treated him like he wanted to be treated. I know a lot of people and some of the players, some of the teammates were a little bit resentful, but he carried the franchise. His 72 season was just legendary for what he did, carried the team on his back, and the Chicago fans responded. They came back to the park, and the White Sox were the benefit of getting a new radio deal with WMAQ. I mean, remember, we haven't even talked about it. One of their main characters of the 72 season was Harry Caray.
Yeah.
And so it gave Harry Caray from going from basically a 50 watts station with WTAQ to back to 50,000 watts with WMAQ the following year in 1973.
We're going to get to Harry Caray and other topics as we move ahead. I do want to ask one more question about Dick Allen. And in doing research for this interview today, I learned something, a tragic episode in Dick's life. I'd not been aware of this, but his daughter, Terry Allen, was murdered in 1991. What exactly happened there? What were the circumstances?
All right. Not too many people knew about this murder. It wasn't something he publicized about. She got murdered in the early 90s. It was basically a murder-suicide situation with her boyfriend. According to Dick's son, Doobie Allen, who I know very well, and also from Dick himself until he died in 2020. She was just the bright star. She was in television as an announcer. His post baseball career and all his bid for Hall of Fame candidacy would be a lot different if she was alive. It was a devastating experience. And so when he got his number retired by the Phillies in September of 2020, I was Dick's Chicago guest to come there. And it was a very special event. And he threw out the speech that he had prepared, and he kind of started off the talking about Terry. And one of the things I will tell you about Dick Allen and his family, they're very religious Christian family. And he had a lot of forgiveness in his heart. A lot of the past trespasses in his life with people. He gave a lot of forgiveness. But the Terry thing was just devastating. It still is. And so I had a family member of mine who was murdered right before that ceremony. So I understood what it was like. And it just was a very significant mark on his life, but he didn't broadcast it. But he did, when it mattered, he talked about it.
Yeah. I had a chance to meet Dick Allen probably 10, 12 years ago. I was actually asked to do a baseball related talk in the Philadelphia area, and Dick Allen was there that day in the audience. I didn't know that was going to happen, and he came up and talked to me afterward, and could not have been more gracious. I'd heard, so many things about his controversial career in life, but just seemed to be a gem of a person and an experience that I'll never forget. There were other very interesting players and personalities on that 72 team. One of them is the ace of the pitching staff, Wilbur Wood, shown here. Not a classic athlete in terms of his physical stature, but he won 24 games for the Sox in 72. He logged a remarkable 376 innings in 49 starts. And as both of you describe in the book, he was really a throwback to an earlier time. He didn't really fit in with 1970s baseball, but he helped the Sox an awful lot.
Yeah, that's right. He was a throwback. He would take the ball whenever necessary, whenever needed. He wasn't the classic athletic looking pitcher, but he had a great career, specifically with the White Sox. He played for the Pirates for a while, but he started off with the White Sox as a reliever, and learned. He had thrown the knuckleball before, but he really learned from his bullpen cohort, Hoyt Wilhelm, with the White Sox in the late 60s. He was part of that great 1967 White Sox team, the last of the great go-go White Sox teams that battled to the last week of the season with Boston and Minnesota and Detroit, a battle that Boston ended up winning. But he eventually ended up starting. Chuck Tanner and Johnny Sane, the pitching coach, were a key in giving him the ball as a starter. And he took the ball and he definitely ran with it. He had an incredible 4-year period from 1971 to 1974, known to take the ball for both games in a doubleheader. He did that a couple of times. He just was a taciturn, and is a taciturn but friendly, New Englander who just knew how to pitch, specifically the knuckleball. He concentrated on the knuckleball, of course, and he was, along with Dick, he was the greatest player on that 1972 White Sox team.
You interviewed him for the book, right?
I did.
Both did.
Yeah.
Yes.
And his memory, his recall, very good.
Well, when I talked to him, he was fine. He was great. This was during the pandemic, so he was sheltered. He hadn't gotten out. He's still living in Boston. Doc talked to him probably 4 or 5 months after I did. I talked to him in early 2021, I believe, around February of 2021. When did you talk to him, Doc?
I talked to him in late December of December of 21. I've talked to him since. He got the book, loved the book. He's still sharp. I don't think he's as sharp as he was before, but he's just a great person. He's in Boston where he grew up. He was a pharmaceutical salesperson, physician. So we had something in common. He'd get into doctor's offices by bringing autographed pictures of himself, because a lot of doctor's offices don't let pharmaceutical reps come in their office. And so he had a little different technique. His problem was he didn't like to fly, so he hasn't come to many events. But there never be another Wilbur Wood. And you actually shorted him, Bruce, 2/3 of an inning. It was 376 and 2/3 innings. And that White Sox team, Wilbur Wood, Stan Bonson, and Tom Bradley started 130 of 154 games that year. No one will ever do that again.
Yeah. Well, it's a perfect transition to my next slide. It is Tom Bradley on his 1971 and 72 Topps cards. A forgotten name today, but he was a very good pitcher for the Sox in the early 70s. So in 72, he wins 15 games, 2.98 ERA through 260 innings. And I understand he was very helpful to you guys in writing this book. Great insights.
Yeah, tremendous. I got to be very close with Tom when we first brought him back to, we had a 40-year reunion for the 72 team then. He just was tremendous resource for us. He was probably the smartest guy on the team, though Rick Reichert would probably say he was smarter. But Tom Bradley, he got his degree from the University of Maryland right during the season. He graduated in classical studies, and there's a famous Baseball Digest story about, his future fantasy was to become the baseball coach of the University of Maryland, and that fantasy came true. He was a coach for around 10 years. Just a great guy. The best story about Tom is the fact after the 72 season, he needed extra money, helped pay some of his tuition off. And so he sold season tickets for the White Sox. And so he ends up getting traded by Roland Heeman to the Giants in December of 72. And so he was really hurt by that, but he was so loyal to the team, he even stayed the rest of the winter selling season's tickets for the White Sox, even though he's going to the Giants.
Wow. He's also the guy that's credited with giving this man, Rich Gossage, his nickname Goose. Is that true?
That is true.
Yeah.
They lived together as roommates in the western suburbs, and that's how the name got started, and it was definitely something that Tom Bradley gave, and he was a really good mentor as far as how it was to be in the major leagues for someone like Goose, and so they lived together for that season, 1972. Unfortunately, Tom got traded to the Giants and was there in 73.
The story I read that Bradley saw Goose pitching during a spring training game. And when Goose looked in for the signs, the way that he kind of strained his neck made him look like a goose. So the nickname came in the spring of 72. It remained with Gossage ever since. Gossage did write the foreword to the book, so obviously he gave his cooperation. As a rookie, struggled a little bit pitching mid-relief, but eventually becomes a standout. How much credit does Johnny Sain deserve in developing the young Goose Gossage?
Johnny Sain deserves a lot of credit, along with Dick Allen for developing Goose Gossage. Johnny Sain,
Chuck Tanner.
And Chuck Tanner, sure, yeah. Johnny Sain, his mantra was the breaking pitch, curveball, slider. Rich was a fireballer, a fastball pitcher, and Johnny Sain hammered into him. You've got to alternate that. Hitter's going to be waiting on that fastball, so you've got to alternate with a really good, effective breaking pitch. So that's something that really elevated Goose. And with Dick, helped Goose because he was sort of his big brother, and he gave him advice from a hitter standpoint. And he told Rich Gossage, never be afraid to throw inside, because Goose Gossage that was one of his latent fears. He didn't want to injure anybody, and he didn't want to throw inside. And Dick Allen said, you've got to throw inside. You've got to let them know that the plate, that the inside corner of the plate is yours, and you have to possess it, and you have to let the hitter know that inside corner is yours. And this is something that stuck with Rich Gossage throughout his 20-plus year career. But Johnny Sain was an incredible pitching coach, as we've talked about earlier, with the three-man rotation. Wasn't popular with everybody, wasn't popular necessarily with Stan Bonson, who was a hard-throwing pitcher, and he said Johnny Sain didn't do it. As great as he was, he didn't help him out in terms of with arm fatigue. Steve Stone, who legendary broadcaster for the White Sox, said the same thing when he was brought in 73. But they all respected him and loved him, and Johnny Sain was just an instrumental figure overall, but especially for Goose.
One of the great things about the 72 Sox, they had so many interesting players and personalities. We could spend hours talking about these guys. You had Carlos May, whose thumb was blown off in a a training exercise during the Vietnam War. You had the great Walt No Neck Williams, one of the most unusual looking players in baseball history, colorful guy, tremendous appetite as well. And then one of the most colorful players in the history of the game, I guess one of baseball's unofficial clown princes, Jay Johnstone. They were all part of that 72 team. And then, of course, you talk about the broadcast booth, and as colorful as anybody was this guy, Harry Caray. You know, we look back at Harry, we tend to think of him first and foremost for his days with the Chicago Cubs, but it was really in these White Sox years that he started to form this persona, the guy who would sit in the bleachers, sit in the stands with his shirt off. He would mingle, he would interact with the fans during games, after games. One of the things I've also heard is that a lot of the players, whether it's the White Sox, Cubs, maybe even earlier in his career with St. Louis, a lot of players didn't like Harry because he could be very critical, very brutal in some of his assessments of poor play. Is that true? Is that the sense that you get as well?
Very much true. I had the good fortune of meeting Harry Caray a few times very late in his career. I worked at the Tribune Company, broadcast obviously for WGN and for another 24-hour news station called CLTV, which the Tribune owned. And he was definitely a man of the people, even at an advanced age. He was just a wonderful, generous person, generous with his time. That said, you know, earlier in his career, before the Cubs, but because by the time he got to the Cubs, he was forced to change his act somewhat by the Tribune Company. But before then, he was hypercritical. He would not stop. He would not stop himself if he saw something that he didn't like on the field. He was like a fan in the booth, and that was his appeal. He was saying and thinking what the average fan was thinking, and as a result, you know, players definitely didn't appreciate it. They didn't appreciate it with the Cardinals. You know, there's a great book called The Long Season that Jim Brosnan wrote back in 1960 or 59 when Harry Caray was with the team, where his wife is livid at comments that Harry Caray made about Brosnan. And you know, in our book, Chili Dog MVP, the players to a man could not. They could deal with him on the you know, after games. They were not they didn't hesitate to drink with them, and Harry wouldn't hesitate to drink with them either. We have his drinking diary from 1972 that we feature in the book. Almost every day of the season, he would use this. He would write down the bars that he went to write it off, right? You know, to expense it to the White Sox. But every day he would go to a Rush Street bar and he would drink with, you know, a player who happened to be there, either a White Sox player or an opposing player. So he was hypercritical of players when they didn't do what was expected of them, and the fans would listen to that and would echo that. So sometimes players felt threatened. Bill Melton famously said, you know, I just couldn't take my time I appreciated my time with the White Sox, but the worst thing was having Harry Caray broadcast the games, because after games, the fans would accost me if I didn't do well because they were listening to Harry. So players definitely did not appreciate his candor, but to Harry's credit, he would not hesitate to approach them after a game and say, hey, I didn't think you played well. I thought you were dogging it, so I said it on the air. Now let's go have a drink. So he was a great individual, like a lot of the players and management in the White Sox organization, an iconoclast.
I'm very curious about this relationship. I think it actually came in later years in Chicago. I don't think Pearsall was there in 72, though I could be wrong.
No, he wasn't.
There may not have been a wilder broadcast duo than these two, Harry Caray, Jimmy Pearsall. I've always heard that they really pretty much hated each other. Is that true? Is that an exaggeration? Any insights on their relationship?
Well, Jimmy started in 77 with Harry. And, you know, I got to know Jimmy before he died. He actually lived in Wheaton, western suburbs. I went to his house in Scottsdale. He had pictures of him and Harry up several times in his condo in Arizona. I never heard him say any ill word. It sounded like to me they had a good relationship. But they were a very iconic team because just like John talked about, they told it like it was. It was like it was the biggest outdoor saloon in Chicago. It was Comiskey Park in the late 70s, and they had just a broadcast style that the fans were endeared to because they told it like it was, especially during the 77 Southside Hitmen, where the most beloved third place team in baseball history had a great season. So Harry is an important character in our book, and that's when him and the other important character, non-player character, Nancy Faust, hooked up in the 1971 season, and obviously their relationship further helped propel Harry Caray when he began his tradition of taking me out to the ball game because of Nancy.
It's fascinating to look at the relationships that develop on a team. And in doing a book, it's pretty rare that a writer, a researcher would go to a source like the team organist, but Nancy Faust, whom you mentioned, and I believe she's in our audience today watching this program, but she was a tremendous source of information for you for this book, right?
Oh, most definitely. Doc knows her very well, and I've loved Nancy from my childhood days. She's just a phenomenal human being and just a brilliant musician, a game-changing musician. She was the person who invented walk-up music. I mean, she was the first person to really comment on the game musically. Something which virtually every other team copied, either through an organist or through other stadium entertainment. Just a brilliant person, a brilliant musician, and she started with the White Sox in 1970, and she was still in her mid-20s. That was the year that as Doc mentioned, they only drew 500,000 fans, and she was sequestered in the center field bleachers, where Nancy would say there was no one around me when I would be playing in 1970. But soon she was moved behind the plate, and she became just a popular figure, not only among players, but she kept her door open, and fans could always come in and offer up requests. She's just another great individual who was a part of that White Sox team. I mean, Doc knows her very well as well, and I'm sure he has some great things to say about Nancy too.
Well, Nancy is extremely special to the White Sox organization and baseball in itself. I mean, I really feel that there needs to be some special categories in the Hall of Fame, and she would be one of the first that I would recommend. I mean, she's been inducted into the Baseball Reliquary in Los Angeles, which is an alternative Hall of Fame, but for her impact on baseball, obviously, what until recently most people didn't know, she was the inventor of walk-up music. She played Jesus Christ Superstar. I'm gonna start crying thinking about how special that was. When Dick would come up to bat, it was an unbelievable experience. That organ at Comiskey Park, and that was the days before you had all the blasting stereo sound. She was it. Her and the PA announcer, they were the entertainment. And she just brought that special feel with players. And starting out that walk-up music, was just a very special thing. And, it's a tradition that's forever is going to be because of her initiating, editorializing of the game. And secondly, I've talked about the Take Me Out to the Ball Game tradition in 77. And then obviously, what she's most famous for is the most famous sports taunting song in the world, Nana Hey Goodbye, the steam song that was done in Mercury Records in Chicago in 1969. That came out of the 77 Hitman thing. So I mean, what an impact from sports at all. And she's also just the most kindest woman. She gave back to fans. And, she really is just given so much back to Chicago. And she was an important part of the chapter because she was an important part of the team. And we also have a picture in the book with her in his fashion show with Bill Milton and Wilbur Wood. And I had to get permission from Wilbur Wood in 2021 for me to actually put that picture because his first wife was upset because it was too provocative. with Nancy on top of him. So anyway, she's just a very special person. Baseball owes a lot to her, and I'm so glad that she helped John and I. And a lot of people also didn't know that the Cubs tried to steal her from the Sox, and we talk about that in the book.
Twice they tried to steal
Yeah.
us. And
Another
envied by teams across the major leagues because of her brilliant musicianship.
Yeah. I miss the organ music at a lot of the ballparks. It used to be a staple of many stadiums. It's now been replaced by recorded music, but that's a complaint I have that can wait for another day. We talk about beloved figures in Chicago history. Certainly Nancy Faust, one of them. Another, the late Roland Heeman. Now, he's the Sox GM in 1972 de facto, but the title actually belonged to a different guy, Stu Holcomb. Heeman, I don't think gets the credit he deserves for putting together this 1972 team. Yeah, they weren't as talented as the Oakland A's team that won the division, but they had a pretty good core of top-notch players. And of course, the Allen trade by itself really transformed the situation.
Well, again, I've had a very special relationship with Roland. He was a baseball wizard and loved Chicago, loved his time in Chicago. I mean, his impact in the game is just like Nancy's, Arizona Fall League, graduate school for baseball players is, one of his lasting things, plus also what he's done for the Scouts organization and stuff like that. Roland was always somebody that had time for the fans. Mm-hmm. And I got to know him for 25 years, and he's never gotten the credit for what he did for the Sox in 72 with very limited resources. John Allen, the owner, they did not have very good financial reserves. He had bought the team from his brother in September of 1969 after his brother Art Allen had sold it to Bud Selig to bring the baseball back to Milwaukee. So Roland deserves more credit. I personally think that he deserves to be in the Hall of Fame as an MLB executive for what he's done, his impact in the game, and just this picture is from when he won the Buck O'Neill Award I think it was 2011. He was the second recipient.
Correct.
So just a charming human being. So many people in baseball will have nothing but positive things to say about him. I do make one comment you brought up about Stu Holcomb. That was one topic that was only thing was off limits with me with Roland. They just had such a falling out, and he wouldn't speak ill of him, but he just wouldn't give any commentary.
Is your sense that Heeman was really the guy that ran the team, though?
Oh, yes. Stu was instrumental in the business side. I mean, he's the one that hired Nancy Faust. He's the one that hired Harry Caray. So he deserves credit for that. But I think from the baseball management side, it was Roland and Chuck, their insight to players and player development. Stu had been basically a football guy. And I mean, he deserves some credit, for what he did to help. He's the one that hired Tanner and Heeman, but really it was really Roland, his skill, his relationship. He was always on the phone doing trades. He would just regale you with stories. And again, think about somebody, he survived 3 different franchise ownerships. He went from the Allen family to the Veck family, and then to the current ownership group with Reinsdorf, Eddie Einhorn.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then he came back in 2005 as a special advisor for that World Series winning White Sox team as well. So he had long ties with the White Sox.
Well, you mentioned John Allen, the owner of the team in 1972. He and his brother had been co-owners. His brother wanted to get out, wanted to sell the franchise, as you mentioned earlier. So John Allen basically took over the majority ownership. He's not a well-known figure in baseball, but in many ways, the guy who kept baseball going in Chicago. Without him, maybe the team relocates. Possibility, no? Absolutely.
Bill Veck himself, when John Allen passed away in 1979, he said, "This is the man who saved the White Sox for the city of Chicago. Not once, but twice. So the Allen family has a long history with Bill Veeck, going back to the Cleveland Indians in the 40s. They were minority investors in the Veeck ownership of the Indians in the 40s, and the Browns when Veeck bought the Browns in the early 50s. Longtime investment banking family on LaSalle Street in the city in Chicago. Veeck brought him into the White Sox fold when he bought the team from the Comiskey family in 1958, late 1958. And Veeck ended up selling to Art Allen and his brother John. Art Allen took the leadership role in ownership. And in 1969, he had been threatening this for a couple of years, implicitly threatening this by playing games, well-populated games at Milwaukee's County Stadium in 68 and 69 when the Braves had left and before the Brewers got there. Bud Selig, famous commissioner, Brewers owner, was trying to get a team back into Milwaukee, and he had his eyes on the Chicago White Sox. And he had a handshake deal with Art Allen in 1969 to sell the Sox to him, and Bud Selig would bring him up to Milwaukee. It was a handshake deal. When he let his brother John know this, John said, that's not what I want to do. I want to keep this team in Chicago. I want to keep this team in Comiskey Park. Why would I go to a city where I'd have to lease the stadium when I own the stadium in Chicago? He was a quote unquote sportsman, loved the game of baseball, loved the Cubs. His daughters loved the 1969 Cubs, and he also loved the White Sox, and he loved Comiskey Park. And he was the man who said, you know, the Sox need to stay in Chicago. They need to stay on the South Side. And when he sold to Bill Veeck in 1975, that was the intent, to keep the Sox in the city for Chicagoans.
And he did, and it's important to note that even when he sold the Sox to Bill Veeck in 1976, well, it was late December of 75, he retained 20% ownership of the White Sox until he died in 1979. Most people don't know that. So he really is an unknown savior for the team in Chicago, that an American League charter team remained in the city.
So many intriguing figures and wonderful stories in the book, Chili Dog MVP, Dick Allen, the 72 White Sox and a Transforming Chicago. You can purchase the book by going to the website, and it's simply chilidogmvp.com. And that's chili as in the food chili, not the temperature that we get in Cooperstown. CHILI, chilidogmvp.com. Learn more about the book, purchase copies of the book. You can also find the book on Amazon as well. Gentlemen, I want to thank you both for joining us. It's been a lot of fun. I thought I knew a lot about 1972 baseball, but I learned a heck of a lot more today. We do really appreciate your time, and best of luck with the book.
Thank you so much, Bruce.
Thanks, Bruce. You great questions and great pictures.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it, guys. Again, our guests have been John Owens and David Fletcher for this installment of the Virtual Author Series. They have written a very entertaining book, Chili Dog MVP, Dick Allen, the 72 White Sox, and a Transforming Chicago. This, of course, one of our many different programs that we offer virtually. And if there's any that you want to catch up on, if you want to watch this one again and analyze any mistakes I made, you can do that by going to our YouTube channel. It should be up there in a few days. And of course, all of our previous programs that we've done are at the Hall of Fame YouTube channel as well. Our thanks to John, David, all the listeners and viewers as well. Hope you enjoyed it. Have a great day, everybody. Take care.